All right, everyone, welcome. My name is Lauren Davies. I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Chapters and Networks here at the UConn Foundation. Thanks for joining us for our new Healthy Huskies sessions today. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Mira Dessy. Mira is a 84 graduate of the School of Fine Arts and an author, speaker, and holistic nutritionist and real food advocate. She emphasizes the importance of healthy lifestyle through whole foods. And thank you so much for joining us today, Mira.
Well, thank you for having me here, Lauren. I'm excited to share. So I wanted to thank everyone who's on for taking time out of your busy day to spend your lunch hour with me. Today, we are going to be talking about Nutrition Label 101. Do you really know what's in your food? And before we do that, I wanted to take just a quick second to talk about how I came to be the person who's presenting this talk. So as Lauren said, my name is Mira Dessy, and I am known professionally as the ingredient guru. I am one of these people who just finds a nerdly fascination with all the things they do to our food, how they manipulate our food, how they modify the label, how they try to trick us into buying things that perhaps aren't great choices for us. I came to this through my own health journey. I had an immune system collapse, and in the process of trying to learn how to reclaim my health, discovered that our food was really, really important. And in that process, developed this, mission, if you will, to help people understand what's going on with food and how they can make better, more nourishing choices for their body. So one of the first things that I want to point out about food labels, if people read the label, the vast majority of the time, they're simply looking at the calories. They're not really looking at the ingredients that are on the label, and they're not paying attention to some of the other information about the label that actually tells us more than we realize. Part of my mission today is to help you break down the label so that you really understand it, but also to give you information to encourage you to truly take the time to read the label. There is so much useful information there. And if you learn how to do that, you will change what's in your pantry and how you're feeding yourself and your family. One of my big sayings is, it's not just what we eat, it's what's in what we eat. Part of the challenge that we have is that many of the ingredients that are used in our food are used for manufacturer convenience. And they are not there because they contribute anything nutritionally to what we're doing. Unfortunately, a lot of these ingredients also tend to come with a wide range of health issues, and they're allowed to be in the food because of something called GRAS, generally recognized as safe. And when we look at things that are generally recognized as safe, we have to remember that this is the manufacturer telling us that this is okay, but it perhaps sidesteps the issue of how much we're getting and what some of the downstream effects of some of these ingredients can be. And we're going to talk about a few things as we go through this presentation. So one of the things that you need to understand is that the nutrition label is actually two things. The first part is what's called the nutrition data. And then the second part, which I feel is the more important part, is the ingredient panel. The nutrition data is certainly important, but we're going to talk about why there are some challenges with relying specifically on that. The ingredients, however, are the ingredients. And so we want to make sure that we're looking at that in order to truly understand what we are eating. So when we're breaking down the nutrition facts, one of the things you have to remember is that serving size is actually determined by the manufacturer. There's some general governmental guidelines, and the federal government has encouraged food producers to adjust their serving sizes because many of them are decades old. but they truly are set by the food producer. And so when you look at that, you have to remember that all of the nutrition facts have to be adjusted for the serving size. One of the examples I use for people, if you actually read a cereal box, such as a granola, you'll see that the serving size can be as little as a quarter of a cup. That's about a handful. And I don't know too many people that eat just a quarter of a cup of cereal. Usually what happens is you have a bowl, you have a box, you pour it in, you go, I'm about that hungry, and that's how much you eat. But no one then sits there to reverse engineer that and figure out how much are you getting and how does that break down across all of the nutrition facts that are on this section of the label. All facts are based on a 2,000 calorie a day diet. Not all of us need 2,000 calories a day. And when we stop to really break down how much we're getting, especially if we're multiplying, that becomes a way for us to see that we may actually be consuming far more than we think we are of certain macronutrients, and also looking at how we're not perhaps balancing some of our sodium or sugar or fat intake the way we would want to in order to have better health. Anything that's on the label in bold is mandatory. It's required by the federal government. And then the breakdown items are not required, but are usually there because consumers want to know how much is in there. One of the biggest challenges that I have, this is a picture of the new food label that has finally finished being wrangled over, and presumably they'll be leaving it alone for a while. The last few years, there's been a lot of back and forth. So when you go to the grocery store, you may actually see several different kinds of food labels. This year, 2022, all the old label stock should be phased out and all the labels will come to this new format. There is no daily need for sugar. We do not have a requirement for sugar. Unfortunately, one of my big quibbles with the label, the way they've done it right now, is that they do have, if you look, you'll see 4% under the daily value for this particular serving size. We do not have that daily requirement. And so that could potentially encourage people to consume more sugar than they need. According to the American Heart Association, the added sugars allowable for reasonable health are 36 grams a day for women, that's about 6 teaspoons, or 42 grams a day for men. This particular product contains mostly added sugars. And so you can see how with just one product, this is 2 tablespoons, it can add up quite quickly across a day. One of the other things that I encourage people to really pay attention to when they're reading a label is something that I call funny math. And funny math happens usually with fats and sugars. You'll notice on this particular product, it says that trans fats equals 0. So under the total fat, they're breaking down how much of it is saturated fat and how much of it is trans fat. Now, one of the problems when we look at the label and look at the ingredient panel is we see hydrogenated vegetable oil there. And anytime we see anything that is hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated, that is definitely a trans fat. And so now you're probably going, well, how are they allowed to say that trans fats equals 0 if they've got it in the product? That's because if it is less than 0.5 grams per serving of fat or sugar, they are allowed to say that there is none in the product. The problem is when we get to as small an amount as 2 grams of trans fats, it can start to have an impact on our body, a negative impact, and can cause issues with cardiac health and some other things like that. I mean, eating 2 grams of hydrogenated vegetable oil is not going to give you a heart attack, but it has a cumulative effect. So as we consume more trans fats, it builds up in our body, which is problematic. One of the issues with this is that back in 2013, trans fats were removed from the generally recognized as safe list. They were considered no longer safe. However, they were not banned from the food supply, which is why we still have them in our food. And this is one of the big reasons that I really encourage people to take the time to read a label, and not just the nutrition data, but to actually look at the ingredients down below, see what's in your food. Now, at this point, some of you are probably thinking, man, when I go to the grocery store, I buy a lot of stuff. I don't want to be looking at all those labels. That's a lot. I totally hear you. My purpose is to encourage you to start a little bit at a time. If you're reading this and you're thinking, well, I eat that product, I wonder if mine has trans fats in it. Start with one thing, make one change, read that. As you're bringing other things home, begin to learn to read the labels before you put them in your pantry. But I'm going to encourage you to not spend 5 hours at the grocery store trying to read every single label before you put it in your cart. Just start with one category, move forward from there, and slowly but surely make changes that you can implement. And as you've mastered one, move on to the next one. Now, when we take the time to read the label, one of the things that we really need to do is get into the habit of actually flipping a package over to do that. Part of the challenge that we have is that food producers are very, very good at selling us product. My commentary on that is that they're not really in the business of making food. They're in the business of making money. Food is simply how they do it. One of the things that they do is to try to find ways to convince us not to read the label and use something called front of package labeling. So this is where they put buzzwords or key phrases that they know are very attractive to convince people that the product is healthy or what they're looking for, so that they'll put it in the cart instead of actually turning it around to see what's in the product itself. So we do need to take time to look at that. As I mentioned, however, we certainly don't want to be spending half a day at the grocery store. So we start with one section, start with one type of product, learn how to find those choices that are better options for us, and then shift from there. The other thing that happens when we take time to read the label, when we go one product line at a time or one category at a time, it also helps us help our family to shift. Our palate is so sensitive, and we are really very attached to certain flavor profiles or certain products that we've come to identify with. Food producers know this. They work very, very hard to build brand identity. The biggest example of that, of course, is cola. You can talk to people and say, are you Coke or Pepsi? And they know exactly which brand they prefer. The interesting thing, actually interesting side note, there was a study that was done, and although people said that they were Coke or Pepsi people, if the product was not labeled, if it was just a blind taste test, most people apparently preferred Pepsi because it has more sugar in it. So just kind of interesting. But the reason they brand us is because the lifetime accumulation of a branded customer is invaluable. Not only that, parents tend to brand their children. And so this then becomes a generational brand, which is worth a lot to a manufacturer. When we learn to look past the labeling, past the front of package information, past the brand, we can actually begin to make very, very healthy choices. One of the things that I encourage people to do is to be what I call brand disloyal. If a brand changes something, I will stop buying it. I am not committed to you just because you are a particular brand. This is also really important. It's very, very difficult to stay on top of who owns your food. The vast majority of what you see at the grocery store is owned by 5 major food conglomerates, and they've gotten very, very smart over the years. Now, when they purchase brands, they do not rebrand. They do not change it into their label. They simply add it to their brand empire. And you can find that information online, but you have to go hunting for it. And it's very difficult and very confusing to stay on top of it. So sometimes a company may, for example, purchase a product and then over time change that product. An example of this is Ben and Jerry's. When they were first acquired by Unilever, Unilever left the company pretty much exactly as it was. And now years later, there are ingredients that never used to be in there that are not healthy choices. And so we really have to take the time to read the label a little bit at a time and make sure that we're making choices that are the things we want to see. So one of the other things that I think is really, really important, as I was mentioning, it can be really difficult, really challenging to go through a food label and go through the grocery aisle by aisle and do that. So that's why we take the time one at a time to address certain products or certain things. These are what I call my 7 simple rules for healthy grocery shopping. And with these rules, just as I encourage you to look at one product at a time or one section of the grocery store at a time, I also encourage you to just pick one rule at a time. We're going to go through these. I'm going to break them down for you. And then from there, we want to just talk about finding the one that works best for you and making sure that we're incorporating that in a way that you can get through the grocery store without spending all day there. So rule number 1 is, do you have to look it up? I do not believe you need a degree in biochemistry in order to provide healthy food for your family. If you do not know what an ingredient is, I truly encourage you to not buy it until you've had a chance to research it and make sure it's something that you want to see, you want to eat. And here's the thing, I get it. For example, when quinoa first became big in the grocery store, a lot of people, were looking at it and thinking, I don't know what that is. So that's where we want to make sure that we understand it, what it is, and how it might be something that we want to consume before we actually buy it. Rule number 2. Does it have a number? So my joke here is real food does not grow by numbers. There is no such thing as a carrot 12. You cannot buy kale 37. It does not exist. When we have numbers on the food label, those are indications of some sort of a chemical formula. Fortunately, in the US, they actually have to put the word and the number on the label. In other places, such as Australia, Europe, they use something called E-numbers. And so in those countries, people have to learn what are the good E-numbers, which are the safe ones that are not chemical ingredients that they don't want, and which ones are the ones that they want to avoid. So for us, the foods that tend to have numbers are mostly colors. So things like blue number 2, very easy to identify, and also preservatives, things like polysorbates and those sort of things. If it has a number after it, we don't want to consume it. Talking about colors just really, really quickly for a second. In the US, we do not label food colors as an issue, and I'll be talking about that more in next week's class, but I want to encourage you when you're looking for these things to remember to also look at your personal care products. It's not just the food where some of these things apply, it's also personal care products. So rule number 3, does it have 4 or more syllables? This is one of those rules where you have to think about it because, for example, macadamia has 5 syllables, but we love macadamia nuts. They are delicious, they're tasty, we know what they are, we know that they're edible. There are, however, a lot of long chemical names out there that are included in the food label that are part of the food. And we want to make sure that those are the things that we're avoiding. Now, one of the things that can happen if you pick a particular rule, and let's say you pick the 4 syllables or more rule, it can be very easy sometimes. You're in a rush, it's late, you got to get home, you got to make dinner, or you're on your way somewhere and you're picking something up and you just throw something in the cart. You're either picking something out of habit, because we do shop by habit. As a matter of fact, grocery stores know that. That's part of why they do a reset every now and then, because the longer you spend, the more you shop. If you know where something is, you can go straight to it, buy it, and leave. And they really want you to hang out in the grocery store a little bit more. But if you have purchased something on autopilot, I really want to encourage you, when you come home with your groceries, look at the label before you put it away, before you put it in the pantry. And if it's something that you didn't mean to buy, I'm going to encourage you to take it back. And if they ask, usually they don't, but if they ask, you say, I've just discovered there's an ingredient in there that I am not able to eat. They will take it back. They do not want to force you to buy something that you cannot eat. So do take the time to do that. And I will share, by the way, personal story. I'm not immune to that. I saw a new pickle product at the grocery store that looked really good. And I sort of did a quick scan of the label. I'm like, yeah, it looks pretty good. Put it in the cart because I was in a rush. I got home, but I read the label before I put it in the pantry, even now after all these years, because again, I'm brand disloyal. They changed the label a lot. And so I turned it over and it turned out there was one ingredient at the bottom that I did not want. So it was like, oh, darn, well, I gotta take that back. The next one, rule number 4, is it unpronounceable? And again, this is one of those where we have to learn. So for example, acai. In the beginning, nobody knew how to produce it. That little cedilla at the bottom kind of threw a lot of people off. It's like, I don't know what that is. Now we know it's very delicious, super fruit, usually in juices, wonderful, great. So just taking the time though to make sure it's the thing that you want is really, really important. The next thing that we have is, does it end in ATE? Again, another rule that we got to think about, kind of like learning a foreign language. You know, there are exceptions. Pomegranates, for example, end in ATE. They're delicious. We love them. They are a great nutrient-rich food. Wonderful, wonderful. However, there are also things like sorbates and galates and nitrates, and those are things that we don't want in our food. Taking the time to look at that part of the label and just remembering to think about it. If it ends in ATE, is it a real food or is it something that we don't really understand? And if we don't understand it, why are we eating it? Rule number 6, is it enriched? So there are 2 things that are done to our food that people sometimes mix up, and I'm going to address them both under this rule. One is enriched food. When something is enriched, it's usually wheat product or grain product that this happens to, and it tends to be the first product on the label. So you'll see enriched wheat flour. If you see the word enriched, please put it back on the label, on the shelf. What enriched means is they have stripped a lot of the nutrients out of the product, and then they've put a few of them back. In the case of wheat, they remove approximately 22 nutrients, 22 micronutrients. And what happened is when we first began to learn how to do that, as they processed the flour more and more, it became fluffy and light. And as humans, we are just so attracted to fluffy bread. We love it. And unfortunately, a lot of people began to get sick because they removed too many nutrients. And they discovered that what they needed to do is put back some of the B vitamins that were missing. Occasionally, they'll put back a little iron or a little calcium, but they're only putting back 4 or 5 of the 22 that they removed. So enriched flour, using that as an example, is still a nutritionally deficient product and is also something, the enriched things that they put back are chemical analogs. They're not putting back the actual micronutrient. So that's important. The other side of that people sometimes get confused about is something called fortified. Fortified foods are where they add something that doesn't belong in a food to that food. The biggest example that I share with people is when they put calcium in orange juice. Calcium does not exist in oranges in any way, shape, or form. And somebody apparently decided that maybe kids weren't getting enough calcium. And so the best way to do it was to throw it into orange juice so that they could drink the juice and be getting some calcium. I am not a fan of fortified foods. One, I'm also not a great fan of orange juice. I'm not opposed to juice, but if you're going to have juice, just have a little. Please don't be drinking orange juice in order to get your daily calcium. You could do things like leafy greens and sesame seeds and all kinds of other healthy things rather than drinking orange juice for that. Some of the others that are a little bit weird, I once had a client, I was at her house and she said, look, I found omega-3 peanut butter for my son. I'm like, okay, what's in there? And we turned it over and it had fish oil in it. Not necessarily a big fan of fish oil in peanut butter. Now you can't taste it because there's not enough in there to do that. But for somebody who has a fish allergy, that's not great. And most people, they see the omega-3 on the front and they don't turn it around. So they don't know where it's coming from. We really need to take the time to read that label. So fortified foods, again, something to definitely treat with suspicion. I encourage you to avoid them, but understand what they're doing to your food, how they're manipulating it. And then the last rule is it all letters and not words? This becomes really important when we think about how much space they have on the food label. So a couple of ways that they manipulate the label is to either make the print very, very tiny. You practically need a magnifying glass. Technically, they're allowed to do that. They can go down to a certain print size. So, if you need a magnifying glass, then I would encourage you to use one, but to be aware of that. The other thing that I don't like is they use difficult color combinations, gray print on a red label, for example. If you see a lot of ingredients, generally the rule is put it back. But if you're looking for it, one of the ways they save space on the label is to use all capital letters. So you may see things like TBHQ, EDTA, BHT, BHA. Those are abbreviations for longer chemical formulations. For example, BHA is butylated hydroxyanisole. And so in order to not have to put that on the label, they abbreviate it. Now, one of the things that has happened in the last couple of years is that food producers are becoming more and more aware of the fact that food producers are becoming more and more aware of the fact that food consumers are becoming more savvy. So people are reading the label, people are making different choices. One of the things that I saw, because when I go to, my family won't go to the grocery store with me. When I go, I still look at things that I have no intention of buying. I just want to see what they're doing to the label. And I actually find it very amusing, but I use it as education as well. So even though I no longer buy breakfast cereals, I certainly read the labels on them. And one of the things that I saw is at the bottom of the ingredient panel, there was a space, like a blank line, and then there was another little line and it said BHA added to package for freshness. So because it was embedded in the package, they technically were not required to list it as an ingredient in the ingredient panel. My thinking on that, however, is that if it is in the packaging, if it is touching the food, it can migrate into the food. There are over 4,000 food contact materials that are allowed in the food supply. Many of them, most of them do and can migrate into the food and have an impact. So just because it says it's in the packaging doesn't mean that you don't still want to avoid it. So just to reiterate, these are 7 rules. These 7 rules, if you follow them, will help you avoid the vast majority of negative ingredients at the grocery store. But you do want to start one thing at a time. Don't try and do them all. Don't try to, try to address all of them at the same time at the grocery store. Pick one, start with that, and then from there, you'll be able to move forward. So one of the things that happens when I talk with people about what's going on with their food, learning how to read the label, learning how to incorporate these changes, is they want to know how they can make changes. Where do you find all this information? And quite frankly, that's part of what led me to become the ingredient guru, because as I was trying to learn more about food, I discovered it was really difficult to find a good source of information about all of this. And that's why I wrote my book. It's called The Pantry Principle: How to Read the Label and Understand What's Really in Your Food. And so in the book, we do have a couple of things that we've already gone through, the 7 simple rules and how to read a nutrition label. And then I break it down, helping people understand additives, colors, and we're going to be discussing some of these in next week's call. But one of the things I really want to encourage you to do is to take the time to learn how to make these changes, how to make mindful decisions at the grocery store. We're going to take it one step at a time, because when we do that, in the beginning, it feels kind of overwhelming. You're making changes. You're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do this, or it feels very overwhelming. But I promise you, if you just make one small change, that's one thing more than you were doing before. And once that one's done, you make another small change, and then you make another small change, and then you stop and you look back and you realize you've actually made a lot of changes, and your diet is better and you feel better, and you're not including all of these negative things in your home. So this is just a little bit about me, which Lauren already covered. Now, one of the things that we did ask was for people to send in food labels, and we did get one. I'm so excited about this because I'm really looking forward to sharing this with you. The label that we got was for Stevia, and a lot of people like Stevia. They think it's a great choice because it is a 0-calorie sweetener. It is approximately 300 times sweeter than sugar. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if how many of you use Stevia, but sometimes if you have it in like a container, you open the container and even the dust from the Stevia tastes very, very sweet. So a lot of people like it because as humans, we are programmed to seek out sugar. We love sugar. It's a good source of energy. The challenge is we're not designed to live in a feast of sugar where it's readily available in all these different ways. And so we look for lower calorie, 0-calorie options. Now, I'm really glad to see that this particular person did not send in something like an artificial sweetener. I'm vigorously opposed to those, and I'll be talking about those next week. Stevia is not necessarily a bad thing. However, when we look at this package, under the ingredient panel, we see that it's not just Stevia. So here's part of the challenge. It does have some erythritol in it. Erythritol is a sugar alcohol. It's not necessarily a bad thing. However, consuming large amounts of sugar alcohol can have a negative impact on the body. It can have a laxative effect. This Rebiana is actually stevia leaf extract. And so it can potentially be manipulated chemically in a lab. And then this also comes with natural flavor. Natural flavor is one of my least favorite ingredients. And part of the reason for that is the legal definition of natural flavor allows us to use just about anything we want as long as it comes from certain sources. And we can then identify it as a natural flavor without really talking about what it is or where it comes from. The example that I like to share with people, just because I think it's pretty funny as well as pretty amazing, is that there is a natural flavor called Castoreum. And except for a really weird liquor from Sweden, I have never seen Castoreum on a label. And I believe the reason for that is because if they had it on the label, people would go and look it up and they'd know what it was, and they may change their mind. It does tend to have apparently a vanilla or strawberry sort of taste to it, flavor. And so sometimes if you see natural vanilla flavor, natural strawberry flavor, it might be this ingredient. I'm not going to lie, there is not a lot of Castoreum in the food supply because the industry has changed a lot. I share it just as an example of what is possible to be labeled as Castoreum. Castoreum is the anal gland secretion of beavers. I tend to call it beaver butt. And so that is a natural flavor and is something that has appeared in food, not in a lot of foods anymore, but definitely possibility, except for that one weird liquor. Like I said, I've never tasted it, but I've heard about it. Now I will share, I was at a conference once and I was sharing this story and someone said, they raised their hand, they're like, is Castoreum bad for you? And the answer is no, not necessarily bad for you. As a matter of fact, for those who follow homeopathy, there is a homeopathic remedy that utilizes Castoreum. My challenge is I feel it's deceptive to hide it under natural flavor and to not tell you what it is. There are a lot of things that they do that with where they don't tell us what it is because they don't want us to know, because they know that people might be a little wigged out about that. One of the other examples of not being fully transparent on the label is Starbucks has a strawberry frappuccino drink that they make, and they were using plant-based colorant. And at one point they changed the colorants to cochineal, and they revealed that it was cochineal on the label, but most people don't know what cochineal is. A lot of people don't read the label, so they weren't necessarily paying attention until somebody, because this is the day and age of the internet, somebody went online and said, hey, cochineal is bugs. It is, it's crushed beetles. And a whole bunch of people got upset, including a whole bunch of people who can't eat bugs because of dietary preference or religious reasons. And there was such a hue and cry that Starbucks was forced to go back to the plant-based option. And the reason they went to the bug-based option is probably because it was cheaper. But you know, by using cochineal as the identifier, it sort of hides it, and people skip over things that they don't know. This is why I want you to read the label. Take the time to read the label, become familiar with it, and one step at a time, just make a change and a choice for healthy grocery packages and how you fill your pantry. So I am going to stop sharing here, and I'm going to come back to the presentation. I do want to thank you all for allowing me to share this with you. I understand we may have a few questions, and so I'm going to ask Lauren to help me with that.
Yeah, we do have a few questions here. First one is, can we send out the 7 rules? And if it's okay with Mira, we can do that. And we can send them out in the post-event follow-up email, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, totally fine. I mean, my understanding is you're sending this recording to everybody who signed up, so they'll have that slide, and you can definitely take a screenshot of that, write it down on an index card, whatever works for you.
All right. Another question. What are some of the common buzzwords that you mentioned that were on the front of packaging that we should be wary of?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so one of the big ones right now is, of course, the word organic, because food producers know that a lot of people are looking for organic products. And so, for example, at the grocery store, I saw this package and it said made with organic blue corn in really big letters. And when you flip it over and you read the ingredients, 3 ingredients, not bad. They were the organic blue corn, they were canola oil and salt. The challenge with that is canola oil is the most genetically modified crop on the face of the planet. And one of the issues is the active ingredient in the pesticide that's used, why it's genetically modified, is to resist Roundup. And glyphosate, which is in Roundup, is a chelator and can be very, very damaging to gut health. So we were then taking these organic chips and frying them in an oil that has an ingredient that is not good for gut health. So that's one. The other is right now, the big thing is probiotics. You know, everybody knows that we need to protect our microbiome. We're learning more about microbiome supporting foods, probiotics, nurturing, nourishing, all of that kind of stuff. And so they're putting probiotics on everything. My joke is like, I think they would put probiotics on floor polish if they thought it would sell. But really, you know, a client of mine actually just sent me a picture of something that she saw. It was prunes that had probiotic bacteria added to them. So again, they're just trying to get you to buy it. And then one of the other things is that we also want to be aware of manipulative terms. I was at the grocery store the other day and I saw applesauce and it said gluten-free. And apples don't have gluten. They've never had gluten. And there's nothing in there except applesauce and unfortunately sugar. I think apples are sweet enough. They don't need added sugar, but so they put the gluten-free on there because they're trying to attract people to buy the product because, ooh, it's gluten-free and I'm eating gluten-free. So those are some of the manipulative terms that they use.
Great. So you mentioned in one of your first slides, you discussed kind of the difference between the trans fat and the total fats that we see. And can you just speak a little more to what kind of the differences between those and what makes one what we call healthy fats versus unhealthy fats?
Sure, that's a great question. So when we look at fat on the nutrition data, it's telling us the total fat content, how much of that is saturated fat, because many have linked saturated fats to heart health issues, and then trans fats. There is also, you know, unsaturated fats. They don't identify that specifically. They're identifying the saturated fats because of heart health concerns. The trans fats is where, as I said, I want to encourage you to look at the ingredients to avoid anything that says hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated. And there's just different forms of fat. We do need fat in order to be healthy. We need it for hormone production. And I'm not just talking sex hormones, like all of our hormones require fat. Our brain requires fat, our nerve linings require fat. So we do need fat in the diet, but we want to make sure that what we're getting are those fats that are good choices for us. And unfortunately, we know that trans fats are not.
Great. On kind of along those lines, can you suggest some other choices for oils other than canola oil that might be a little healthier?
Yeah, I am a big fan of olive oil, avocado oil, and coconut oil. And I know coconut oil gets a bad rap because it is a saturated fat. However, if you delve into the research with coconut oil, it's actually kind of an interesting story. Back when there was some science looking into different kinds of fats, margarine was becoming really popular because we thought that we needed to eat this low fat, no fat, modified kind of fat. And so they started hydrogenating, you know, oils to make margarine. And the producers managed to somehow convince the government that coconut oil was not good because it was saturated, and saturated fats are bad for us. So it got a bad rap. The challenge is it's actually a naturally saturated fat, and there are a lot of health benefits. It's a medium chain triglyceride. It's actually really good for us. So my three top oils for like cooking and possibly light frying or that kind of thing are olive, avocado, and coconut. I'm also a fan of things like for baking, for example, a little walnut oil or a little hazelnut oil are delicious. They give a wonderful buttery, nutty flavor. So those are good choices as well.
Great. So our next question. So we saw a list of 7 rules, and these are great rules, but they contain a lot of what's in a lot of foods. We have a few people wondering here, how do we prioritize that? What's most important on that list to kind of prioritize what they should be looking out for, but still allowing them to, you know, eat a good majority of foods?
Sure. And, you know, I get it's very confusing to learn how to change your diet. After all, we're operating from X number of years of having eaten either on autopilot or not paying attention to the label. I encourage people to start with what's most important to them. Sometimes that means if you're working with someone, you have a particular health issue, and so you're wanting to identify or modify certain things. For me, honestly, I started personally, and I encourage a lot of my clients to start with what I call the easy ones. Colors, numbers, those are easy to get rid of because that number stands out on that food label. Like that's just, but, and the thing is, it sounds like, okay, it's easy to get rid of. However, what we have to keep in mind is if you're getting rid of something that's got an artificial color in it or got polysorbate 60 or whatever, you have to find an option that your family will like. And so that takes time. It's a trial and error process, one step at a time. So starting with that and starting with the all capital letters, those were my two big ones. The next one that I got rid of personally was enriched because that was really easy. Like it's usually the first word on the label. And then from there, just beginning to refine it. But those are the easy ones to start with.
Great, thanks. Do you have some suggestions on what would you say the best and most nutritious fruits and vegetables would be?
Wow. So that is such a broad category. There's a couple of things that I would like to share about that. One is I'm a huge fan of seasonal eating. When we eat fruits and vegetables that are in season, they typically are more nutrient dense because they are picked in season and they're not force ripened or stored for a long period of time. So that's definitely good. Learning to know what's in season in your area and starting with that. I'm also a huge fan of what's called the Dirty Dozen list. And this is a list put out by the Environmental Working Group. And every year it comes out usually about March because it takes them a few months to collate the data. But they look at the pesticide load of agriculture in this country, and then they release a list of those fruits and vegetables, the 12 that are most highly contaminated by pesticides. And it's a pesticide residue to the point where you can't wash it off. Like it's systemic in the product. Apples are almost always on the list. A couple of years ago, kale made it on the list. That was very sad. So when you're purchasing Dirty Dozen, however, you need to think down the line. And so that means not just buying organic apples at the grocery store, which luckily many grocery stores now do carry organic apples. It's easy to get them. However, you also want to look and make sure, are you buying organic apple juice, organic applesauce? Any product that has apple in it, is it organic? Because if it's not, you're getting a high pesticide load. So for fruits and vegetables, buying seasonally and buying organic for the Dirty Dozen would be the best way to get the best options for your health.
What are some good suggestions for healthy choices of snacks and cereals that I know you mentioned that a lot of snacks and cereals do tend to have a lot of these, words we can't pronounce and a lot of kind of these things that we're looking out for. But do you have any suggestions for ones that actually do have a kind of a smaller ingredient list and actually are healthy?
Well, cereal is a really tough category. We have gotten very accustomed to being cereal consumers in this country. As a matter of fact, a lot of people, have a habit of having cereal as a snack or having it for dinner if they're hungry and it's late and they don't want to think about it. And unfortunately, cereal doesn't necessarily represent a great choice. If you're going to consume cereals, I am a big fan of at least whole grain. So for example, oatmeal, cooked oats, that at least you're getting some fiber and you're getting some nutrition that way. I'm not a fan of the processed, colorful, puffy, all those kinds of cereals. If you're a do-it-yourself kind of person, making your own granola is great too, because you can reduce the amount of sugar in there and still have something that's really tasty, really wonderful. Maybe throw some fresh fruit on top if you're looking for a little more sweetness. So that's definitely a good option. When it comes to snacks, food producers have convinced us to have a snacking culture, in part because it's much more profitable for them. If they can encourage us to eat more food, they make more money. And one of the things that has happened, if you look at charts of how people consume calorically over the decades, one of the things that's happened is the snack category has grown and has become a very large part of our caloric intake. My thing is we also are biologically programmed, we like crunch. And I forget what the decibel level is, but there's a certain decibel level that if something has the right snap and the right crunch and the right level, man, we just go crazy for it. And that's things like potato chips and crackers and things like that. So we tend to want to consume a lot of those. My encouragement is instead try and find protein. If you're hungry, having a little protein will help you bridge that gap to your next meal rather than eating foods that are not going to nourish your body, like junk food snacks. And so having some vegetables with hummus or black bean dip, maybe having some hard-boiled eggs and one or two crackers is fine, but just finding ways to add protein as a snack instead of the carby, crunchy, snacky, salty, fatty things or sugary things that we tend to go for.
Great. Can you speak a little bit about packaged food versus fresh food? So for example, packaged lettuce versus fresh lettuce in a bunch, or canned vegetables versus fresh beans, and kind of what the difference is and should people be looking to buy stuff that are not necessarily packaged, or does it not make a difference?
That's actually a really good question. So fresh is best, in my opinion. However, having said that, frozen is also a good alternative. Frequently, frozen foods are picked fresh and flash frozen, so the nutrients are preserved. When we have canned food, those tend to be heated. They also tend to have preservatives in the can. If you want to get really picky about it, a lot of those cans are also lined with BPA, which is bisphenol A, which is a hormone disruptor, so not a great thing to have in your food. So I'm not opposed to having canned food available for emergency situations, or if you're buying clean canned food products that don't have added things and that are a clean canned lining to the best of your ability. But I really do prefer fresh. If you're saying fresh versus packaged, I'm assuming you mean something like, sadly, when you go to Trader Joe's, the zucchini, they have 2 zucchini on a little styrofoam tray wrapped in plastic. I hate that. I feel like it's not good because, it's more plastic, more waste, environmentally not very friendly. So fresh is best, frozen is good, canned food is next, but again, always making sure that it's as clean as possible.
Great. So you spoke a little bit about how foods are enriched, and you mentioned that you are not a fan of fish oil being added into the peanut butter, and that's not the best way to get your omega-3s. Can you suggest some other ways and some healthier ways to get those omega-3s?
Yeah, the best way to get them is actually to eat the fish. So cold water fatty fish have the highest level of omega-3s. It's best to choose wild caught because they're not being fed commercial fish food. And the smaller fish are actually really good. I know a lot of people, when it gets to the bigger fish, have concerns about heavy metal accumulation, mercury, and those kinds of things. So doing sardines, herring, anchovies, great. And then some of the bigger fish, maybe a couple times a week. But the best way to get your omega-3s is to do the cold water fatty fish. You can also get some omega-3s from walnuts and things like chia. And then for those people who have a higher need of omega-3s, if they've maybe done some testing and discovered that their levels are off, then I would consider fish oil, like supplementing, but you would want to work with a doctor or nutrition professional about that to figure out how much to supplement and then find one that's a good quality.
Great. I think we have time for one last question here. Are natural sugars as bad as added sugars? When you see a package and it says there's no added sugar, but there is some natural sugar in there, Can you speak a little bit to the difference of that and added sugar being, real sugar, being a chemical sweetener, and kind of what would we prioritize there in terms of what's healthier?
Sure. When they say added sugar on a food label, they're talking about taking something such as sugar, maple syrup, honey, just malt syrup, any of those kinds of things, and adding those to the product. When it's no added sugar, it's because the sugar comes from the product itself. For example, let's say you have a Lara bar, and those tend to be made from dried fruit. They have a high sugar content, but there's no added sugar. They haven't added extra sweetener to them. And so the added sugar rule is talking about when they add additional sweeteners. And as I mentioned, the ADA recommends 36 grams a day for women, 42 grams a day for men. When it comes to consuming those things that naturally contain sugar, primarily fruit, you still want to be sure that you're not over consuming. Like, you want to eat a reasonable amount, because sugar is sugar. When you're consuming it in fresh or frozen fruit, there's a little bit of fiber to help slow down how fast it can hit your bloodstream. If it's dried fruit, it does hit the bloodstream pretty quickly. However, dried fruit is not classified as an added sugar if that's what the product's being made from.
Great. We have actually one last question here quickly. What's your thoughts on soybean oil?
So soy is another product that is heavily genetically modified in this country. So there's a lot of glyphosate residue on that. And part of the challenge too with glyphosate, in addition to the fact that it does modify the microbiome, the gut biota, it also, because it's a chelator, it binds with nutrients in the soil, things like calcium, et cetera. And so that prevents the plant from actually getting that nutrient. So if you have crops that are continually planted in the same soil over and over and continually sprayed, it's not really good. So that's one reason why soy can be a challenging ingredient. The other reason that soy can be challenging, you just have to be careful about what your personal bio-individual status is. Soy tends to be a phytoestrogen, a plant estrogen. And so for some people, consuming a little bit of soy is maybe not a bad thing. But unfortunately, in this country, we tend to believe if a little bit is good, a lot must be better. So then all of a sudden we have soy milk, soy ice cream, soy cheese, soy chicken, soy, like you could eat soy all day long and think you were eating different products, but you were actually just eating soy. So really being mindful of how much you're consuming and the fact that it is a potential phytoestrogen. And then the third challenge is soy is also goitrogenic. So for people who have thyroid health issues, you do want to be mindful of having a lower goitrogenic diet so that you're not consuming too many goitrogens, which interferes with the thyroid's ability to function.
Great. Thank you so much.
That was a really big one to end on.
That was a perfect question to end on. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. And thank you so much, Mira, for taking time out of your schedule to teach us all of this. And I hope everybody enjoyed this session, learned something new. And I hope you all have such a great day. And don't forget to join us next week on Thursday with Mira again for what's lurking in your pantry. And if anyone would like to submit more nutrition labels.
Yes, please submit a label. I'll go through them with you.
Yep. Please do. And if you have already registered but would like to submit a label, feel free to email me. You can reply to any of the emails that you have received for this event. And those will go straight to me and we'll make sure we get them to Mira. All right, everybody. See you next week. Have a great day.